And welcome back. Now we're going to talk about some very important statistics that were recently released by Statistics South Africa. So if South Africa were a suburb of 100 households, 22 of those households would be beneficiaries of government's indigent program, namely that grant for the poor and needy. Now, Stats SA's recent non-financial census of municipalities provides some insight into those households that struggle to afford access to basic services. Also yesterday, as Stats SA published their retail trade sales for the month of September, and there was a 0.7% increase compared to the same time last year. But to help us unpack all of this, we join now from our Pretoria studios by Joe de Beer, who is Deputy Director General for Economics at Stats SA. Joe, thanks so much for speaking to us this morning.
Good morning. Thank you for the invite.
So here's the first fact. So 22% of households in South Africa are classified as indigent. So let's perhaps start there just by defining what an indigent household is.
There isn't a standard definition for that. The municipalities each have their own criteria for when they decide to classify a household as an indigent. Mostly money metric values are used, but in some municipalities they might take a geographic approach. For example, deciding the western part of the municipalities where typically the poorer households would be. So it makes comparability across the country a little bit more difficult, but at least in general we can get a fair idea of the number of households that the municipalities would classify as being indigent. Once they are classified as being indigent, they are then of course eligible to receive services from the municipality for free, whether that would be electricity access or water or any of the other municipal services that they would not have to pay for.
And we'll break that down into more granular detail shortly. But just off the bat, in terms of the numbers, has there been an increase or a decrease in the number of poor, needy South African households?
It fluctuates a little bit because the definitions aren't always stable, but generally more households are classified as being indigent.
So, Joe, if we can then just break it down, starting at provincial level, and it seems that the Eastern Cape comes in here as the province with the most number of indigent households. Just break that down for us a little bit more, please.
Yeah, the Eastern Cape being mostly a rural province, if we can put it that way, has many pockets of poverty, and many of those municipalities would sort of be dominated by households that might be unemployed, or even if they're employed, maybe it is for a very low wage. So based on the metrics that the municipality would have, they would classify at the moment is just under half, about 44% of the households are being deemed to be indigent.
And if we look at the municipalities, 257 municipalities we have in this country, and it would seem eThekwini was the municipality there that seemingly is suffering here.
Yeah, for the municipalities it also depends a lot on whether they are a municipality that tends to attract staff or the population. Because if you have a municipality where people think that there are job opportunities, they would come from neighbouring municipalities into that municipality without necessarily having an employment opportunity already. So they will reside within that new municipality, but as they are not earning any income, they would then be eligible to apply for indigent status, and if they meet the criteria of the municipality, they will be classified as such and then start receiving some of the basic services.
And interestingly, there, eThekwini, the largest number of indigent households, followed by Tshwane and then Cape Town and Johannesburg. And I would imagine for exactly the same reasons that you've mentioned.
Yeah, all the metros. If people are in the rural areas and you think, well, there aren't any job opportunities for me in my local municipality, what am I going to do? I'm going to go to one of the bigger cities and see if there isn't an opportunity for me there.
So, Joe, when it comes to these households, these indigent households, so they have to go to the municipalities to obviously apply for these indigent grants. Is that process, is it actually working well at this stage?
a tough one for us to judge. But if we judge by the number of households that are classified as indigent, that would give us some sort of comfort that there is successful processes in the municipalities for the people to actually be classified. But whether all the households that would deem themselves to be indigent are actually recorded as such, that I don't have any information on.
Do you have any information about, the sort of campaigns that municipalities would perhaps run and whether they are doing those successfully as well?
It's not something we specifically collect, but I am aware anecdotally of municipalities that would do some sort of marketing advocacy to make sure that the poorer households are aware of this option. There's very little value in the municipality having the scheme in place if the people that they are targeting don't know that they have the option to come. So there is outreach activities, but I guess as in all cases one can always try to do more to get even more people aware of it and to apply to see if they would qualify. But ultimately the aim for a municipality would be to have fewer households classified as in need of basic services for free, because we would all rather have a situation where the households are gainfully employed and they are in a position to actually pay for the services that they use.
And of course, once you've been classified indigent, you don't get to remain indigent for life, because that has to be assessed, your situation from time to time.
Exactly. Especially if it's a money metric one, because then you could get a situation where you move from an unemployed household to an employed one, and then of course your income changes, and for those reasons you will then no longer be considered.
Joe, let's move to, some of the money talk again around this, and the municipalities who are struggling here, the retail graphics and what they are telling us. On the retail front, there was a 0.7% increase in retail sales compared to the same time last year. Well, what is that attributed to?
It's a bit of a mixed bag if we look at the monthly retail sales. As you correctly said, if we compare it to the same period last year, there was a real increase of 0.7%. And that was mostly driven by the types of retailers that sells household goods, household appliances, textiles and the like, a little bit more from sporting goods, reading materials and the like. But unfortunately, if we compare it to just the previous month, there's been a decline of 0.6%. So it's a little bit of a volatile series. What one can do is to rather look at it at a quarterly basis. So if we compare the last 3 months with the previous 3 months, it gives us a growth of 1.5%, which is quite encouraging if we're going to start looking at what the impact is going to be on the GDP.
And in terms of the sectors, which sectors performed better, Joe, and why?
The general dealers, which are the big retail shops that we are aware of, they remained fairly flat, but we did see good sales from the semi-durable items, as I mentioned, the textiles, the clothing, household furniture. But on the negative side, we've now had many months of declines from the typical hardware stores, selling paint, glass, and the types of things that we would typically use in the construction sector. And we see that reflected in our estimates of the national accounts for the economy, where the construction industry seem to be still struggling. And this is reflected in the sales of these construction type materials that people would typically use.
And as you indicated, generally you would want to actually look at these figures over a longer period of time. But as it stands right now, the question that one wants to ask is about this recession and whether these figures are indicative of us staying in that recessionary framework, or do you believe that we are moving out of it?
Well, we're still busy doing the sums, actually. In the first week of December, we will publish the estimates for the third quarter economic growth, and then we will see whether we recorded a negative or a positive number and managed to lift the economy out of the recession. But the latest retail numbers are in a positive step.
All right, we'll wait for that. But we're coming up to the festive season, of course, and will people overspend? Will they tighten their belts? Because this is always a concern around this time of year.
Now, historically, the retail sales used to peak in December for the Christmas sales, and of course we tried to adjust for that. But over the last few years, we've had the phenomenon of the Black Friday coming in November. So from a personal perspective, not just as an economist, I'm sort of looking forward to see how this Black Friday is going to take place and whether the spending spike is starting to move away from Christmas to earlier of the year to the Black Friday. And I think a lot of people will be making use of the opportunity to do a lot of Christmas shopping, not over the Christmas period, but rather over all the specials that we're going to see a couple of weeks earlier.
Well, one space where there won't be a special, it doesn't seem like, is in the petroleum space. And, you know, we've seen a minus 3.2% a negative contribution in this regard. What's your forecast? What do you think is going to happen over the festive period here?
Relating to the fuel price, it's a little bit difficult for us to forecast. It remains a function of the exchange rate, the crude price of oil. The oil price seems to be moderating quite nicely. Whether it will continue over December, we don't know. So I'm not sure. Let me play it safe and say that I hope it comes down, but I don't guarantee it.
Like the rest of us there, Joe. And if we look at the rand-dollar exchange rate, you know, how detrimental could that be for our economic outlook?
Look, the argument goes both ways. One could, on the one hand, argue that if the rand weakens, it might be favorable for the export type industries, but then, of course, your imports become more expensive. So it is not an either-or type of situation. One really needs to look into the details of where is our economic policy focused on, what type of industries are we trying to develop, and what would be the most favorable exchange rate. It is not, in our monetary and fiscal policies, we don't regulate the exchange rate. We allow it to fluctuate. So it's mostly determined by market forces.
So just a final thought, what is your advice to South Africans as we approach the festive season? What could we prudently do to at least help safeguard ourselves against economic catastrophe?
Don't spend money that you don't have. Keep some money for the beginning of the next year. There are school fees, the long year ahead.
I think that's sage advice. Joe, thank you so much for coming through and speaking to us this morning. And that, of course, was Joe De Beer, who is the Deputy Director General for Economics at Stats SA, and the institution releasing various statistics on the country's economy. And I guess the sage advice at the end there, don't spend money you don't have. Let's go to a break.